Hello, hi, this is Edward. Um, First of all, thanks very much for doing this, Martin. I can't remember how
Welcome.
we got talking, but I think what you were probably one of the first people I'd really met, probably almost 2 years ago now, who really saw how RPA could work with payroll and HR facilities or functions. So, do you want to give a background on yourself, first of all, and how you got into this space? And I had a few more things I wanted to say before we push ahead.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've been involved in the HR and payroll technology world for more years than I can care to remember. And then about 2.5, 3 years ago, I got a contract to work with a robotics company to develop their HCM solution. So I defined the 5 key process areas, worked through the development of the specifications, how it was going to work, built the sales training material, sales collateral, etc., etc., etc. And that then switched my mind totally into thinking, I'm not going to say like a robot, but thinking in terms of what robotics actually does. And then my next piece of work after that was to work for a very large multinational company, which is proving to be the basis of what I'm going to talk about this afternoon.
Yeah, excellent. Because I think one of the things that when we were talking over the last, 18 months about, turning, your experience into kind of, training content was that actually HR is such a big beast in itself. You have to start breaking it down. And obviously payroll can sit in a finance function or it can sit in an HR function. But, as a standalone entity, there was enough to talk about just on that alone. So, what's your view generally on how to kind of break HR and payroll into pieces and then actually start digesting it?
Well, I built it around recruitment, onboarding, offboarding, training, and payroll. But the first 4 were purely HCM processes, where I always felt it was quite difficult to really do a cost justification and a real business case around how to approach that, which I think is being borne out by a lot of what's going on in the market. Whereas with payroll, on a global context, which in global payroll is primarily my sort of main functional area, it becomes much more tangible rather than intangible. As a result, a business case becomes much, much easier to manage. And then the problem then is fitting a technology option into delivering the concept of robotics for global payroll. So what I did was, in this case study we'll talk about, wasn't to look for a robotics solution, but was to look for a global payroll solution that had a high robotics content inside it. And that's how I would recommend addressing anything similar like this in the short term.
Well, interesting, because my experience of global payroll is that there isn't really such thing as global payroll. It's a series of kind of knitted together local payrolls. I don't know if that's moved on in the last few years, but that was kind of my experience.
No. It's how you manage them and how you put the emphasis of compliance onto the people that are not necessarily responsible for the quality content of the data that goes in there. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is that my client had a situation in fact, one of my other clients had the same problem, where they had their third-party payroll providers actually making payments without authorization on their behalf, which breaks every compliance rule in the book. And that's where, you immediately a robotics approach kills that solution stone dead. If you have a recruitment process and people don't necessarily follow the process breaks, but people still get paid. And that's why, for me, I think robotics and global payroll is something that is hard and fast, tangible, results-driven process within the business.
And
Sorry, you're always dependent on somebody else doing the work for you in many, many ways.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, how with your clients, did they have a problem that you were trying to solve, or did you have to identify the problem in the first place in the solution?
Yeah, well, the problem was that you would have too many people working on a payroll process that, in theory, was sat in all the offices around the world. In this particular case, we're talking about sat on the next desk to each other, but not talking to each other. And there'd be people putting information into the HR solution, going to the printer, printing it off, then passing it on to the payroll person sat next door, who would then be error making in terms of data input. So you've got breaches in compliance because of the data, you've got breaches in the process, and you've got duplication of effort. So all that, when we looked at all the 68 countries worldwide, it was pretty easy to determine how many man hours were spent per payroll cycle, and where it was all falling over, where the mistakes were coming through. And, so that was how we identified the key problem area.
So you had a problem. It was quantified as well. Was it actually you were able to put a kind of a dollar amount on the?
Yeah. There was too much money being spent on payroll, and too many man hours, and too many heads were actually touching payroll. Although you would say there were X amount of full-time people touching payroll, that wasn't the issue. It was how many people across the world were spending 10% of their time on payroll that they didn't need to get involved in it because of the processes. So, we looked at it in terms of finding a new solution that would work robotically to be able to drive a lot of that compliance, save the data input, and manage a lot of those process controls without having the manual intervention in the process.
And were there compliance costs or fines, or was there risks attached to that? Quantify?
Yeah, the company will rarely tell you where they have problems. Sometimes that's something they don't want to wash their dirty linen. But with my particular client, I said to them, well, what happens if you don't pay people enough on your payroll? And the head of payroll said, well, the employees shout and they tell us. And I said, well, what happens if you pay them too much? And she said, well, nobody ever tells us, so we have no way of checking whether we overpay people, which meant that there was no process in place that was able to correlate the payroll inputs to the payroll outputs, determine where the right payments being made. And they looked at it and said, wow, this is a huge big black hole. Let's not bother wasting time about how much it's costing us. We know it exists. Let's just fix it through robotics.
Right. So there's kind of a business case that you could put your finger on, and there's a kind of the unknowns beyond that.
Yeah, it's like the iceberg under the sea. You can see the bit that sticks out, and it's a problem. But you go too near it, and you crash and burn. And there was people losing their jobs over the inefficiencies in their payroll. The accuracy rate was down, and the payroll costs. There's not just the cost of the running the payroll that was high; it was the unknown cost of the payroll errors that they weren't able to quantify.
Yeah, and I think the conversation we're having here around payroll, I liked it as a topic because payroll's never the. Sorry to break the news to you, Martin, but they're never the sexiest of topics sometimes. But in terms of the impact that's for people and the actual number of issues, multiply it across multiple countries, multiple systems, and it gets very complicated. And it's a miracle it works so well, so effectively in 99%.
I'll just take you a little point on that. Net payroll in country is not sexy, but global payroll is a fascinating subject because very, very few people do it completely well. I remember talking to a company a few years ago, and I said, how many payrolls do you have worldwide? And they said, and I checked it, and they had 100 more payrolls that they actually knew they had in operation worldwide. So, it may not be sexy, but it has a high visibility in the company. And the biggest problem is any breach in statutory rules and compliance, you've got another Enron coming up. And that's why it has such a high profile these days.
Yeah, and rightly so. I think it was, but now I think what we're going to talk about now is more the answers and the kind of the options you looked at to solve these issues. Yeah. I think these are options that probably just weren't there or weren't accessible, several years ago.
Oh, true. A lot of the payroll suppliers they don't know what to do with RPA because if they address it and it makes their customers more efficient, it takes away the need to use their services in the first place. So when we put robotics as quite a high element in the selection process, I went around each of them and examined the whole of their approach to robotics. Having spent 5 months working on, deeply involved in it, I could see where their approach was working, where it wasn't. And the first company we looked at that we discounted in the last three, they really didn't. They were talking about it, but they had no strategy. The second company, their approach to robotics and RPA was about making internal processes more effective, but nothing that would obviously benefit the customer. Whereas the supplier that we ultimately shortlisted and went to implement with had a very, very solid attitude and philosophy around RPA, that they would actually sit down with the customers and say, hey, look, this is what we do. How can we work together to make your operation more successful? That is still, even now, 2.5 years down the line, that is a very, very unique approach in the HCM space. And that company has risen quite effectively in the marketplace. So it's very, very important that, providers mustn't be afraid of robotics. They must use it in conjunction with their clients to make their clients work more effectively, not be afraid that it would negate the need for them in the first place. And that was the worry in two of the big guys.
And you see that still as an issue in the marketplace?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely, it's still an issue. I've been through several selection processes for HR and payroll technology, and I've only ever seen one supplier actually address this openly. I've seen people lie about it. I've seen suppliers say, oh, no, we don't believe in it. It's all rubbish. We don't need any form of robotics. And I think some of them, as I said, looking at it purely from their own internal processes and nothing that benefits their customers. So different people approach it in different ways. It's like, they're afraid if they get hold of it, they're going to burn their hands. And they shouldn't worry about that. I think anything that makes their customers streamline their businesses and work more effectively makes them a better payroll provider. But, it's not always seen as easy as that.
Yeah, and it's always a cliche to say they're a better kind of partner, rather than supplier. But, you want that someone who's actually thinking about you as the customer first and foremost, rather than just a plug-in service that happens to happen.
Yeah, agreed. It's functional, and it can be so important to the business.
Yeah, and we've touched on this already in terms of why you picked the solution a little bit. But is there anything here you want to go through in more detail?
Let's have a look. The customer learned where the duplications in the payroll process were. That's right. It wasn't until they started pulling their own processes apart that they knew the number of man hours, as I said, that were being spent on payroll. So, I asked the question, how many payroll people do you have worldwide? And they said, about 20 something. And I'm saying, no, you must have more than that, because if you had that many, then you wouldn't have a problem. You'd have streamlined your business down. And what they didn't count were the people that were touching payroll 10%, 20% of their working day or week. And so what we had to do was look at the whole of the payroll process. And it wasn't a straightforward process. It never can be worldwide. So we ended up regionalizing the process to make sure that the process was actually going to be not mandatory, but what worked best in each of those regions. So you can streamline the process 80%, but 20% of that process had to be specific to the region of the country because of the exceptions that were applicable in that region. So in the end, we had a good business case. We had a good ROI for the expenditure. Unfortunately, they did the ROI right at the very end to justify the selection. They should have done that up front in the business case, but I wasn't involved in the business case. Unfortunately, I started later in the cycle than that. But the reality is, it was the part of the process that they couldn't see that was causing the problem and not being able to manage the cost. So when we actually pulled it apart, we were able to look at each of the process steps, which you need to do to look at any RPF for HCM and identify where we could eliminate unnecessary process steps, which meant process steps were hours spent doing work that shouldn't or didn't need to be done.
And in terms of, we didn't really touch on this, but what was the trigger for them looking at this in the first place? What was the one sort of thing one straw that broke the camel's back for them to do this?
Compliance problems.
Because I think a lot of organizations know there's issues, but it's never quite a priority to actually deal with or to take action on. So what was the sort of trigger here?
They were in breach in some countries of the compliance rules, and the audits had found out that the ICPs, the local payroll providers, had actually made payroll payments without authorization.
Right.
So when that came in front of the audit committee, everybody just, they went berserk. So they said, we've got to have one payroll product that should, in theory, have some element of robotization in there that will eliminate unnecessary hours, but also to make sure that nobody's going to ever get to the end of the payroll cycle and say, this hasn't been approved. So using robotics to be able to manage the approvals in every stage of the process, managed to shorten by 3 or 4 days the amount of time available in the payroll cycle, as well as make sure that people that weren't supposed to do the payroll didn't have to intervene and make payments on the company's behalf, and therefore breaking the whole of the payroll cycle and breaching the compliance.
Interesting. So this was getting attention right at the top level, the audit committee. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, because nobody wants another Enron, and when HCM and payroll touches robotics, quite often the instigation is we don't want another Enron. I've heard that so many times, like people saying we've got to be able to manage the payments and make sure that payments are not being made unnecessarily by the wrong people with the wrong sums at the wrong times.
Right. So kind of. Easy to kind of to apply to other parts of the business as well as soon as they're getting to that kind of level.
Yeah, definitely.
And your journey, I mean, what were the learnings? What were the kind of key things you kind of wanted to?
Yeah, the first point is really, really key here. We looked and thought, is there going to be a robotic solution for HCM that would actually solve the problem? And we couldn't find one, and even now. In the work I do with some of my other clients on HCM robotics is I can't find a solution that's actually going to work. So what we did was we looked for a payroll solution that had a robotics element rather than looking for a robotic solution that had a payroll element, if you see where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
So we avoided the search for the silver bullet that doesn't exist, and we managed to find the solution that had a high element of robotics in it. So
that was a provider that the full package which had robotics element. Okay, right.
Yeah, that's right.
And the next, I was going to say, just generally, a lot of pressure is put on RPA to solve all problems, but I think it's good to be able to package it with other things as well to actually get full value rather than just assuming it's going to solve all your problems.
I think you're absolutely right. We could have spent the next 5 years looking for a solution that would have managed the robotics, and probably never found one that would actually do everything we wanted. But we actually managed to find a payroll solution that was able to control the compliance issues through the way that their functionality worked. I mean, inside their product, they actually called it a robotics approach. So it really was robotics in that sense. So, the next thing we learned was, delivering against the business case is sometimes can be really, really hard when you don't know what the current costs actually are. So we say, how much does it cost to your payroll? And people say, well, we pay the payroll company X amount, or we pay the outsource X amount. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. That's not what the hidden cost of the payroll is. And the reality is that there's so much going on in the payroll solution of people touching things manually that could be handled robotically. And so, I sort of broke that down. I found all sorts of things not happening. Same when I did the next project with a major electronics giant was exactly the same. So we use robotics to drive the compliance, Ed, to make sure that as we went through this, we use the robots to work inside the box as opposed to outside the box. And we managed to eradicate 80% of the manual tasks in the payroll process by using the robotic approach of the supplier. And I keep coming back to this, but I think it's very important, that robots operate inside the box, humans operate outside the box. And I think that's really, really important. And the last point I would say was, there was lots of talk of automation and robotization. The reality is there's a huge difference in HR terms between those two. You can automate the process, but that doesn't mean to say you're robotizing it. And I feel that this organization thought automation and robotization were the two same things until we showed them with the differences, and they fully accepted how the differences manifested themselves.
And how did you explain that to the two differentials, the two separately?
Because automation is just repeating the stages in the process with the computer. It's not actually intervening in the process to make the process work more effectively, and it's not putting the right audit trigger points, authorization points in it. It's just reflecting the keystrokes as opposed to actually having anything to do with robotics. And it's what we call it key scraping. And I'm sure you've heard the same phrase.
Yeah. And in terms of, we're going to move to questions in a minute or two, but in terms of the impact on the people whose, it was 10% or 20% of their job was involving this, what happened to that 10 or 20%? That dropped down to 5%, or was the need to eradicated?
A lot of the surplus payroll resources were removed from the business, including the head of the payroll in the UK, because her work was consolidated and put into a service center in India.
Right.
And she was managing the UK, and then there was other people managing different European countries, and they harmonized all those roles into one single function in the service center and used the robotics approach from the payrolls product to be able to manage a lot of what they did. So it caused I'm not going to use the word havoc, but it caused problems in the organization, because everybody assumes that an implementation of robotics is actually going to remove jobs. And people say, the cliche is you redeploy. In reality, I've rarely seen that happen. More for the same is not an issue. It was a case of removing the cost of the business by taking out the superfluous management tasks as well as the simple tasks.
So in terms of the need for the people, just was reduced because of the automation and robotization.
Yeah, I mean, the consolidation to one global payroll solution only took that process 3/4 of the way. The robotics element of that was the piece that actually was used to reduce the headcount once the process has been harmonized. So I think that was very, very key thing. They could have consolidate the processes and put them into a service center in India, but that wouldn't have enabled a lot of the compliance. It would have just cut people out, and it wouldn't have really changed the way. It would have just shifted all the resources into a service center as opposed to having them split around the world. So the robotics was the major difference there.
Well, that's fascinating, because I mean, the 75% that you could do without robotics, you could have done that 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But actually making a real change to the processes and the compliance and the effectiveness and efficiency, that's kind of something that,
and it got out of the way of blaming people for doing things wrong. They just blamed the process, and people have just historically followed the process. Never mind looking at whether the process was wrong. They just followed the process. So, it's the process was wrong. And the reality was it was the process and the people that were doing the work, because, robotics eradicates the errors. Because it builds in the parameters, the human wise they were doing. As I said, this company was not able to maintain or manage the people that were overpaid in the business, and that's a tremendous mistake.
All right, interesting. No, it's fascinating. I mean, I'm intrigued by sort of solutions that don't just say automate or robotize everything. They actually say, like, let's outsource, let's centralize, let's realign our processes, and we'll apply technology on top of that. So I wasn't really aware that this is what the case study covered, but it's perfect.
Yeah.
In terms of, the questions, obviously the outcomes are, very impressive. And obviously, I think, from that whole unknown benefit you have, you don't know what you're overpaying or what risks you were carrying. So I think even beyond, the question was, did your employers know, could they quantify the benefit in any way beyond the business case?
Yeah, they'd come up with some sort of cost of running payroll per employee, and they actually managed to reduce that cost by about 35% worldwide, which for them was a significant achievement. That made the board much, much happier. So, it was cost effective, it was compliant, but it was also quantifiable. They could look at every penny spent in the whole of the payroll process and know where that money was spent. And one of the things that I must say is that the payroll supplier they chose, one of the reasons they chose that they were going to be a very large customer for them and not a small customer.
Yep.
So in some ways they could actually twist the robotics approach more to their way of thinking than necessarily being envisaged, where if they'd gone with some of the other bigger guys, they'd have been told, well, this is where we automate and you have no choice to deviate from that process. So they really liked having a company that could work with them and allow them to manufacture processes on both sides that made everybody's operation more effective.
And so, one of the questions I had was, I think Martin's just actually asked, a similar one, is that once the organization had seen what could be done in this space around payroll, what was next? Did they look at were they excited by other areas to look at?
They were talking about finance, but the finance transformation was a separate project. As it was, there was no robotics element in the finance process. It was purely in the payroll. It wasn't even in HR. It was purely payroll.
Yeah, it's funny because I've found, especially with bigger organizations, they are pretty siloed in terms of what you've done in one section is a great story, but it could have happened to a completely different company because it doesn't feel as relevant to them, even because you go from payroll to finance to customer services. Each of them is their own silo with their own interests.
Yeah, that's true.
Where would you push them in terms of HR processes? Where would you be pushing them next to?
Well, I wasn't involved in that. They were implementing a Workday solution. It was nothing to do with what I was doing. But I think they had a hell of a job trying to get Workday implemented anyway. So, you can robotize it once you've implemented it, I think. But to take a robotics approach to the core HR processes was just 5 steps too far at that stage in the process.
Yeah. And if you're doing an ERP implementation, it's not the time to look at robotics.
No, absolutely right. HR you would approach in a different way. With HCM, you've got to make sure you got your processes right and implemented, and then look at how you can refine them using robotics. You can't start your process in robotics and then work backwards. So with the Workday implementation, robotics was not in scope. Same with.
But it's funny. I've also wondered whether the likes of SAP or Oracle or Workday are actually finding that organizations are not upgrading or moving to new ERP systems because people are putting tactical solutions on top of it using like RPA. And I'd love to know the answer. I don't think anyone's going to give us the answer in the short term, but I'd love to know if RPA is having that kind of,
Yeah, but just bear in mind, if you're going to robotize your SAP or whatever implementation, you don't need to reinstall or re-implement SAP. Everything you want is already in the system.
Exactly.
It's already there. You're not shaking the tree and, or you are shaking the tree and just finding the stuff that the apples that fall are the ones you don't need. But you're not planting a new tree. And I think a lot of companies think that we're going to do a robotics transformation process, that means we're going to have to implement a new system. No, it doesn't. If you've got your SAP process, the only thing it does is it tends to negate best business practice, because now you've got a different way of doing it that bypasses best business practice contained within the product. And I think a lot of organizations still aren't thinking that way yet.
Yeah, so just before we finish off, there was the question around retaining local country knowledge and local country skills. How did you address that, or did you need to maintain the local skills?
That's a difficult one to address. How do you do that? Well, if you work in a traditional service center environment, you've got tier 0, which is your employee self-service, Tier 1 is your first level support. Tier 2 is your specialists. And if you think of it as a triangle, the most manual process are in level 0 and Tier 1. So what organizations, these two organizations I work with, is they took out a lot of the Tier 0 and Tier 1 and automated that level of the process through robotics and kept the specialists at Tier 2 and above. And that worked more effectively. So if you bear in mind that using a robotics approach to ATM and payroll, you actually get rid of 80% of the simple repetitive tasks, then all you get rid of is administrators. You're not getting rid of process specialists or country specialists in payroll. So they would stay consolidated into a more effective Tier 2 in the traditional service center approach.
Right, interesting. So this is really just the kind of it's a transactional work that's removing, not the knowledge work.
Yeah, definitely. When you can put a lot of the knowledge work into expert systems and AI and whatever you want to call it. In the old days, you'd contact service center for details of a policy. You might take a 24-hour turnaround using chatbots and whatever. You can get that information instantly now if it's managed properly. So, even Tier 2 is not immune from being hit by robotics, because somebody somewhere has to make decisions that bypass the core processes. And again, it's always the 80-20 rule.
Interesting. You touched on chatbots. I was wondering, did your clients look at those as options as well?
Well, it was the sort of thing that they it was just pie in the sky to them. Hey, let's get everything else fixed before we get into chatbots. But I'm not seeing a huge element of companies doing that for HR yet, which is a shame, because HR is probably the most the largest part of an organization that has interaction with its customer base. Finance, you don't have an interaction with the employee base. If you're HR, you do. Yeah. So I'm a big fan of chatbots for HR. I really, really am. I'm looking forward to seeing more of them. But the technology that manages that interrelates with service centers is still very, very weak.
Interesting. So that's a whole different conversation. We should probably think about that as well going forward.
Yeah. Sure.
So Martin, first of all, we're at the sort of half hour mark. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to prepare for this. To me, there's two sides of the HR and payroll story. One is, HR in particular kind of doing what they can internally to kind of optimize their processes, leverage technology, but it's also to start, helping organizations do the kind of the people change journey that needs to happen over the next 5 or 10 years to kind of fully onboard all these technologies. So I find the HR space super exciting, to be in.
I absolutely agree.
So excellent. So I'm going to ramble more on that in the future, because I think I want to come back to it, because for all the technology stuff, there's lots of business change that needs to be done. But so again, Martin, thank you very, very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.